Michael, my Twitter bio says passionately curious, reasonably skeptical. And I try to live my life along this motto or whatever. But in general, I think that maintaining a leveled and reasonable skepticism becomes quite difficult when you're trying to simultaneously be passionately curious. And it often opens that door to relativism where anything can go. So my first question for you is, what is curiosity and how do we define and differentiate it from skepticism?
Oh, interesting. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that before. Usually it's what's the difference between skepticism and cynicism, which has no relation at all other than skeptics of beliefs that people hold dear. Sounds like cynicism to them. Curiosity, well, that is part of the scientific mindset. You just want to know what's true. That's what we all want to know. You know, are aliens really out there or not? Have they really come here or not? Curious minds want to know. And the skeptical position is that the null hypothesis says they're not out there and they haven't come here until you provide evidence accordingly enough to overturn the null hypothesis. That is, reject your skepticism. Reasonable skepticism, not cynicism, not nihilism, not we can know nothing, but just, you know, some proportion of evidence to tip you over into accepting the claim as probably true or likely true or whatever. And it's curiosity that drives us to try to answer any questions. And, you know, I guess, you know, there's an evolutionary basis to curiosity, of course. If, you know, hungry animals, organisms, as they were in behaviorism, become more active when they're hungry. They're burning more calories to get more calories. And so they have to explore their environment, branch out to find food, for example, or mates or whatever, or exploring new territories to find new niches to fill. You know, this is what animals do, and we're animals. So curiosity about the world is you know, designed into us. And, you know, we've published some articles in Skeptic on the origins of the scientific impulse, that is to test hypotheses. The idea is relatively new, just a few centuries old, and even less than that if you're talking about randomized controlled trials and statistical tests of hypotheses and things like that. That's less than a century old. But the idea of testing a hypothesis goes back probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years of tracking. Just hunting and tracking animals requires these bipedal large brain primates to test hypotheses. Well, here's the tracks. Here's what I think the tracks indicate, that the animal is moving this way or that way, and there's shade over there and there's water over here. What's more likely for this organism to have done? Then let's go check it out and see. That's a hypothesis test. That's a kind of a scientific way of thinking. So I don't think it's something that is entirely cultural. That is, we just made up science as part of the Western tradition. I think it's built into the human brain to, you know, understand cause and effect. You know, A appears to be connected to B, and that's called association learning. You know, classical conditioning and operant conditioning, all that's based on pairing two different stimuli together and see if there's a causal connection or not, which the organism does by responding to the stimulus. So the whole stimulus response thing is based on the idea that we try to learn, we try to find cause and effect relationships in the world for survival purposes.
Well, I think it's always easy to fall into that trap of either not being skeptical enough of a claim and perhaps being too skeptical. And when I started this podcast, I remember, because I came into it with so many predispositions and so many normative values I applied to my own scientific view or mindset. And the more I've been exposed to varying theories of consciousness, mind, reality, etc., the more it's easier to see how close we're getting to that relativist reality where anything could sort of go. With that sort of framework in mind, do you think that Karl Popper's falsification method, I mean, the trying to differentiate between a pseudoscience and a science, is becoming harder today because of our lack of understanding of the fundamental nature of reality?
No, I think there's two different things going on. Popper's falsification is true in some instances. That's kind of formally what the scientific method is insisting you do: test your hypothesis, try to falsify it. If you don't, somebody else will. Replication crisis is largely driven by people failing to try to falsify their own hypotheses, and then other people did or failed to replicate, is a form of, falsification of a test. That is formally how the scientific method works. Informally, scientists generally don't try to falsify their hypotheses. They try to find more evidence to pile up in favor of the hypothesis. So it's more Bayesian. I think the way the mind works is what drives scientists when they're working in a Bayesian way. That is to say, in Bayesian reasoning, we want to apply some probability of something being true or false, somewhere between 0 and 100, or let's say between 1 and 99. So in Bayesian reasoning, there's something called Cromwell's rule. Oliver Cromwell, who famously said, "I beseech you in the bowels of Christ, you might be mistaken." And so Cromwell's rule in Bayesian reasoning is you never apply a 0 or a 1. That is, it's 100% false or it's 100% true, because nothing is 100% false or 100% true. Anything could be true. But not just anything in between. It might be a 1% probability of being true or a 99% probability of being true. Those are very different. And so the way scientists work is that they really just try to pile up more and more evidence to nudge the Bayesian probability higher and higher, the credence, that is, in the jargon, to getting other people to accept their theory and so forth. Now, so we have both of those, both Popperian falsification and Bayesian reasoning going on in science. And in our own minds as well, just the way the mind works. There's even theories about how in neuroscience, how neural nets pile up evidence for something to make a connection, to actually grow a new neural synaptic connections and so on in a Bayesian way. That is, the more impulses that are coming in, the stronger the synaptic connections become, and you have stronger memories and so forth. And that's in kind of a Bayesian way. So I think there's a lot there. And I really like the Bayesian method. I've been doing this for a long time because it gets people off this binary way of thinking, that your claim is either true or false. Yeah. And if somebody, thinks that it might be true, then they don't want to accept your challenge that it's false. So if you just say, well, you might be right. I mean, it's possible. I'm just not sure, like what probability would you put on your belief? And most people, they've never really thought of it like that. I believe Jesus, died on the cross and was resurrected and so on. Okay. And if I say, well, I don't believe it, it's false, and then, well, it's like, well, this is my faith. So instead of saying, it's a bunch of baloney and you should stop believing it, how about like, it's possible. It's not impossible. Could be. But let's put a probability on it. What do you think the odds are of somebody who's actually really dead, and then for 3 days, in a cave somewhere, and then they really come back to life? I mean, we've heard stories about this. And most people are skeptical of most of these stories throughout history, but for some reason this one stuck. So maybe this is the one. What are the odds of this happening? Well, how many people have ever lived? Before us, about 100 billion people have lived and died. Not one of them has come back from the dead, or maybe one, maybe. So it's, 1 in 100 billion. Let's put that number on it. Okay. Now, is the evidence for this proportional to 100 billion to 1 against? And the answer is no. It's not very good evidence at all. It's all testimony, and it's not even very good testimony. Because eyewitness testimony is not a reliable means of knowledge that is justified true belief. Justifying your belief as being true based on anecdotes alone is not enough. Just take the recent UAP business, that it's mostly, almost entirely, a series of stories of people that say they know somebody who says they saw something. Or at best, you get these grainy videos or these blurry photographs that people can't quite make out. That's just not enough in science. I mean, it might be, but you got to do better than that. And so we hear these stories in the congressional hearings last month of, well, we actually, I know somebody who knows somebody that saw the spaceships and the alien bodies. Okay, show it to us. Oh, well, we can't. It's classified. Okay, well, why should I believe you? Oh, this guy is trustworthy. He's a general, or he's a captain, or he's a police officer, or he's a teacher, or he's the mayor or the governor. Then they start credentialing the eyewitness to make the testimony more valid, but that doesn't really help at all. It's like the analogy I make is like the Chinese spy balloon. What were the credentials of the pilot that shot it down? Who knows? Who cares? It doesn't matter. We all saw the Chinese spy balloon. There it is. End of story. So, if you want to know what it would take to convince me that the UAPs really represent either aliens or some Russian or Chinese technology, just show it to us. We'll all believe it. Everybody believes the Chinese spy balloon story. There's no skeptics about that, or and so on. And that's what it would take. So, proportionally, you got to have a lot of evidence. And something like the resurrection of Jesus just does not rise to that level of evidentiary standards. It just doesn't. Now, if you want to say, well, I don't care about that. It's my faith. I'm a Catholic and I believe that Jesus died for our sins, and that's the story. And I'm not trying to prove it. Then really my answer is okay. Then there's nowhere to go really from there.
Yes.
And it's in a way it's in a different realm of truth. What you and I are talking about are empirical truths we can actually get at with some evidence or test or something. But if you just say, I really don't know, I just believe it. Okay. Then that's in kind of a different realm, more like art or music or love or something like this, why do you like Michelangelo's Statue of David or this particular piece of music, a Bach concerto or something? And often it's like, I don't know. I just think it's beautiful. It moves my soul or something like that. Okay. And you don't have to prove it, right? That's just a subjective personal belief about something that, really science doesn't have much to say about that. And so I think religious claims are more in that realm.
I often say that I think it was Raymond Tallis. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work, but at some point when I asked him about his views on God or anything in terms of the nature of reality, he said something quite beautiful that I often use today. He said, I'm ontologically agnostic, but epistemologically I can tell you that I don't think it's true. And that's sort of how I label myself. And in other words, I say I'm 99% atheist, but I'm 100% agnostic. I don't really know or what's happening here, but I can tell you that from what I've gathered about the nature of reality, I don't think this is a plausible explanation. And often I get slack from both sides. I mean, merely saying that I've got that 99% atheism, I get a lot of slack. And then also just giving that leeway to that 1%, you get this hard scientists who fundamentally don't believe that there is a deist or theist who also come at me. And I'm talking about friends, family, it can be anyone. Do you think that non-binary approach of actually giving them the room that they deserve also creates a bit of a chaotic environment in terms of the debate?
Well, it opens up the possibility that you could be wrong. And that is true. You could be wrong. Yeah. And by the way, that's the same answer I give. Who was it that you were quoting?
It's Raymond Tallis. He's a neuroscientist based in England.
Okay, I don't know his work, but that's my answer too. Is ontologically speaking, that is on the nature of reality. I don't know if there's a God or not, and I'm not even sure it's knowable in this empirical truth realm. Is there some experiment we're going to run? If we continue to explore the universe for the next 100,000 years, will we encounter God? Well, what if we encountered an extraterrestrial intelligence so far advanced that they can create life forms, they can structure DNA, make cells, create complex life, they can geoengineer planets to become habitable. They can create new solar systems by causing black hole, causing dust clouds to coalesce into stars, or causing stars to collapse into black holes and create new universes. This is all pie in the sky sci-fi, but it science fiction writers have, people like Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov and others have speculated how this could be done.
Yes.
Well, if it, a Dyson sphere, for example, is this just massive solar panels around a star to capture most of the energy, and now there are astronomers looking for remnants of a Dyson sphere out there, and they've found some tantalizing hints, but nothing quite convincing yet. But what would you call an entity that could do things like that? Create life, geoengineer planets, create whole universes. Well, that's what God does, right? That's the very definition of God, that, the entity that created all this. Well, how would you know if you encountered an alien that it wasn't God, or, they're one and the same, they're indistinguishable. And so that's what I call Shermer's last law. Any sufficiently advanced extraterrestrial intelligence, or far future human, I added, would be indistinguishable from God, which I got, of course, from Arthur C. Clarke's third law. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. That to me puts religion and the claim of God's existence in a different realm, because most believers in God, that's not what they're thinking. They're not thinking, oh, this is some super advanced extraterrestrial intelligence. No, they think it's something, an entity outside of space and time. It's not a physical, corporeal being that's just really smart. Most Christians, especially, and Jews and Muslims. So that accounts for what, six of the 8 billion people on Earth. They believe that this is something out of space and time, and that a miracle happened. This entity, this non-corporeal entity, reached in to our world to stir the particles for whatever they think happened. The creation of life, or creation of complex life, or creation of DNA, or morality, or whatever. So there, I just don't know how you could test that. So I just say, look, I don't know. There could be a God if when I close my eyes for the last time here on this earth, and I wake up and there I am in this other realm, and there's God. And it's like, oh my God. I'd probably say something like that. Oh my God. I thought this was all bullshit. Oh no. Now what? And I'm actually not worried about that. I joke about it, but I'm actually not worried about it, because if God really is all powerful, all knowing, and all loving, how could he punish me for, just trying to understand the world? He gave me this brain. This is what the brain does. It doubts things, and that's got to be okay. And anyway, so that's now, but so that, like you, ontologically speaking, that's pure intellectual. I don't walk around the world just like that. I walk around the world assuming, well, there's probably no God. And that kind of Bayesian way, 99.9%, probably no God. But of course, I could be wrong. But just in terms of leading my life from day to day, I don't think about it. I don't go to church. I don't, anything like that.
And it's often interesting because you see the evolution of the way certain religions form, and it's almost inescapable to apply sort of human or anthropomorphize this whatever deity or being that they picture. It's always got something to do with our sort of existence. And yet when we think about some sort of an extraterrestrial intelligence, it will have almost nothing to do with what we are. If you think about it from a perspective of, okay, natural selection on Earth focused and honed its craft in a specific way because of the environment we're in. And no two environments ever display that sort of a similarity, unless, odds statistically, it might be possible, actually. Do you think?
Well, I agree with you. I agree with you. Whatever the aliens are going to be like, they're not going to be like us. Yeah. The chances of them being bipedal primates, with a big bulbous head and almond-shaped eyes and a nose, 2 holes and 2 ears, and 4 limbs, and fingers. This is a very unique anatomical design that comes from the tetrapod forelimb, for example, with our limbs. They dates back hundreds of millions of years to the first fish that crawled out of the sea. The tetrapod forelimb, it's called, and the overall symmetrical body plan, and all that comes from a gazillion contingent evolutionary steps from natural selection over eons of time. The chances of all that happening on some other planet in exactly the same pattern to end up with something very close to us is, almost nil. It's just not going to happen. Even with convergent evolution, on other planets with atmospheres and gravity and so on, something like ours, oceans, you're going to get something like fish in the water and birds in the air, because anatomically you have to have structures that can deal with the medium they're pushing their way through. So if you want to fly, you have to have certain anatomical structures that are able to do that. They're aerodynamically sound. They're super lightweight. In fish, you have to have that kind of fusiform body that can push through a dense medium. That kind of thing. If you're on land, you got to have something like eyes to see and ears to hear, and so on. But if you just look around the experiments that natural selection has run on Earth, the hundreds of millions of species, probably in the billions, how many times has the plan like ours it happened? Well, really, just one lineage. And several 100,000 years ago, there were maybe half a dozen bipedal primates like us. We're the last one standing. We almost didn't make it. They talk about maybe 100,000 years ago, the entire world population of humans was less than 10,000. Some people say even less than 1,000. I mean, we could have easily gone extinct. Neanderthals lasted hundreds of thousands of years in Europe before Homo sapiens arrived. And they had tools and art and something like art, I guess, maybe not quite like Homo sapien art, but probably they had language and so on. And they never developed, technologies like ours. I mean, there's no progress in evolution. Like it's moving toward being a sentient, conscious, intelligent species capable of space flight eventually, and so on. That's just very unlikely. So my answer to the Fermi question, where is everybody, is that you can get all the way up to from bacteria to big brains the size of Neanderthals and never make the next step, because they weren't heading toward anything. They weren't becoming like us. They weren't becoming anything. They were just well adapted to do exactly what they did. So you could get a planet to get all the way up to a Neanderthal level of intelligence and never have radio communication and telescopes and spaceships and things like that. And so I just think the chances of this happening anywhere else is not zero, but it's low. And the only reason why I'm willing to put a very high number on the likelihood of there being extraterrestrial intelligences somewhere in the cosmos is simply because of the numbers are so huge. Hundreds of billions of galaxies, each of which has hundreds of billions of stars, each of which has planets, we now know. And so just by the sheer numbers, you're bound to get quite a huge number that have the right size planet at the right distance from the star, in a fairly non-elliptical orbit, so it's not too hot and too cold, with the right atmosphere, and on and on and on, all the things in the Drake equation you got to get right. The chance of that happening when you have almost 1 trillion galaxies, each of which has, say, 100 billion stars and so on and so on, it's going to be a very high number. But the chances of them finding us or us finding them is very, very slim. It's mostly empty space. The analogy I was taught when I took astronomy was, imagine our sun the size of an orange in LA, where I'm in Southern California. The nearest star would be an orange in Chicago. It's just nothing. It's mostly just empty space.
Unfathomable.
So the chance, it's truly unfathomable. Yeah. The Voyager spacecraft is hauling ass at 70,000 miles an hour. If it were going to the nearest star, which it isn't, it would still take, I don't know, it was like 80,000 years to get there. I mean, it's just the chances of them and then not only do they find us, they somehow keep crashing in the New Mexico desert or wherever. And they're not wiped out. They're still alive. And it turns out they're bipedal primates that somehow understand us and want to have sex with us and probe us and take the parts of cattle. I mean, come on, really, it's the story is just literally unbelievable.
I'm just thinking about you. I mean, you've got people like Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov as like heroes. Have you ever read? I think there was a short story that Isaac Asimov wrote. He wrote two. I think it was in the beginning and at the end. I'm not sure. Have you read those short stories?
No, I don't know those.
I will try and get the actual name of those and send it to you because I think you'll love it. It's such an amazing short story. So basically, I can't remember the first one, but the second one, he talks about almost a teleological process of how this universe is sort of untwining forward, and artificial intelligence plays a huge role within that. But to a point where it becomes so complex that we have no frame of reference as to what this thing is doing. Not at all. And he persistently asks itself, what is the meaning of the universe, or what is the meaning of life? And this thing just continuously evolves to a point where it never really gets that answer. But yet at the same time takes over the entire universe. So it's a pretty neat story. With that in mind, do you think there's some sort of teleology occurring here, even if it's got nothing to do with religion?
Yeah, okay, let's explore that for a second. But first, let me make a note that if we did encounter extraterrestrial intelligences, this is not my idea, but it's not likely to be biological.
Mm.
You hear this David Grush talking about, non-human biologics. So I posted a tweet the other day of a flower, a plant. I mean, it was a bird of paradise plant. Going, here it is. It's a non-human biologic. They're all over the place. My dog is a non-human biologic. Anyway, but a lot of people, like my friend and colleague Avi Loeb at Harvard, who's running the Galileo project, he thinks it's much more likely we would encounter an AI, just because it's so much cheaper to build a small computer than send a biologic, through space. It's as we know from just trying to get humans to the moon and now to Mars, it's just massively expensive to move something that big and have to accommodate, an atmosphere and waste disposal and food and all that. Computers don't need any of that. They can operate at cold temperatures without air, and they don't need food, and they just need some energy, and you can power them with nuclear cells and so on. If that's the way we're going, robotic spacecraft that are getting smaller and smaller, then that's probably what aliens would do. So if we found something, it would probably be technological, which is what Avi was trying to do with scraping the bottom of the ocean floor in the ocean near Papua New Guinea this summer, to try to find the remnants of this probably interstellar meteor that crashed there. Maybe the debris is of a material that is not natural. Anyway, we'll see the results of that soon enough. Probably not, but that's the idea. Okay, teleological. There's nothing directional about evolution from the top down that is obvious. There's a bias in Western culture to see progress everywhere, and a lot of times there really is progress. But even in like paleoanthropology, you'll see descriptions of like a Neanderthal jaw or a Homo erectus skull or something like that. That it's almost human, or it's becoming human, or it's like it's almost like our molar. It's almost like a human molar teeth, as if this organism is striving to become us. Like, if I just keep working at it, maybe I'll become a Homo sapien. No, there's nothing like that in evolution. Most species are doing just fine the way they are. They don't need to change constantly, much less in a particular direction. It would only be on the grandest of scales where, if there were certain environmental changes that drove species to, say, develop larger brains like we did. But even that, we're not quite sure. There's different theories about this. Why do we have such big brains? Why do we have the capacity for language and symbolic communication, mathematical reasoning, aesthetic appreciation, music, art, literature? Why do we have all these things? No other species has them, and they do just fine. You don't need any of that. This was Alfred Russel Wallace's argument later in his life against Darwin, that he kind of broke with Darwin on this. Wallace felt like there's some directionality behind all this, because natural selection would never bother creating a brain the size of ours with all these capacities that are not needed for survival. If you just need to survive and get your genes to the next generation, you don't need to be able to do calculus and all this other stuff we can do. Now, Darwin and others, they thought that's too, what we now call hyperselectionism. That is, a lot of things in evolution happen by accident, or they had some other purpose and they got co-opted for a new purpose in a later generation. Like wings, this is called the incipient stage problem. What good is half a wing? It's not aerodynamically sound. You can't fly with a little nub sticking out of the side of your body. Why would evolution drive the selection of these structures to eventually become aerodynamically sound? There must be directionality to it. And the answer evolutionists give is no. It was not a poorly designed wing. It was a well-designed something else. A solar collector, or a heat dispersal mechanism, or something like this. And there's different theories. Yeah, there's something, there's different theories about this, and even with things like mathematical reasoning and aesthetic appreciation, music, art, literature, dance, and so on, that maybe it's a sexual selection. This was Darwin's second theory in The Descent of Man. that sexual selection, that is, these are characteristics that appeal to mates, and therefore they have value for getting your genes in the next generation through that avenue, not just escaping prey or being camouflaged or anything like that. Anyway, so but my point is that we don't have a definitive answer to that question. Why do we have such big brains that are able to do all this stuff? If you stick strictly to the natural selection model, you end up like Wallace going, there's got to be something else out there pulling us toward it or giving us a push in this direction. And most evolutionary theorists don't think that at all. They think, no, it's just, there's something else going on here. And so you get this, I mentioned convergent evolution. You know, the expert on this is Simon Conway Morris. By the way, his book on this was called Life Solution. And he makes the point that I mentioned that, you know, if you have a planet where there's, you know, certain atmosphere, density of the water, density of the air, you just by physics alone, you're going to end up with body types and limbs that are of a certain nature because that's what works by physics. And so he argued you're going to end up with something like a head with sensory apparatus on one end and a waste disposal system at the other end, and limbs to move around the land, or wings to fly, fins to swim, and so on. That you might end up with organisms that are not terribly different from what we see on Earth. But my rebuttal to that is just look around Earth. I mean, look at an octopus, you know, or just this incredible diversity of organisms where there's not a lot of convergence there in any big picture development. Now, here I'll give a plug for the book Non-Zero, Robert Wright's book, which I really love that book. And, you know, he does postulate a kind of directionality in a game theory analysis that in the long run, if all organisms are selfish and just hoard resources and are violent and so on, that will be selected against in the long run. They could, you know, free riders and cheaters and so on can get away with stuff for a while, but eventually the group can't survive like that. So there's a pressure to domesticate yourself, stop being so violent, be more pro-social, cooperative, altruistic. Ultimately, this ends up with, you know, love and connectedness and bondedness between species, if you're a mammal, right? Anyway, he takes the big picture and shows how that may even apply to the development of civilizations and so on. Most people don't go as far as Bob Wright does on that, but it's not a completely crazy idea. Ultimately, in other words, if there are other extraterrestrials out there or God, you know, it might be something like us that are pro-social, cooperative, and so on. Therefore, we don't have to worry about contacting aliens. They're not going to enslave us, eat us, whatever. They're not going to be. You can't be evil and colonialists and enslavers and achieve space flight and all that kind of stuff. It's just, you need more cooperation. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling here, but that's the idea. It could happen. There could be some directionality to it, but I don't go as far as, say, Bob Wright or his predecessor Teilhard de Chardin with his new sphere, where, you know, the planet is becoming conscious, and, you know, he's been kind of resurrected because of the internet. Maybe the internet is our global brain and so on. Yeah, but there's nothing inevitable about this. You know, it took, you know, capitalism to develop technologies and companies that profit by doing this. That's a unique, you know, political economic system that drives the development of this technology. Nothing inevitable about that. And I'm not even sure what it would mean to say the internet is now conscious or sentient. You know, these are just devices. These are, you know, you have these massive warehouses of servers. You know, the cloud, people talk about the cloud as if it's this airy-fairy like quantum field out there, and you know, all of our information is floating around out there. That's not what the cloud is. These are, you still got to have the physical hardware somewhere to store all this stuff. Right?
Yeah.
So
it's true. I think the more technology gets more and more advanced, we tend to misinterpret what it actually is at some point. I mean, when we used to see it back in the day with all these massive hardware computers, that's when people could tell, okay, this is very mechanical. But now it slowly blurs that line the more we don't see what's really happening. The fact that everything's transmitted via radio waves, etc. And I think that's another thing. I mean, for all we know, another type of intelligence could be light. It could be anything. It could be so completely absurdly different from what we're expecting that we'll have no access to this sort of information. Something I find quite fascinating, though, is when people talk about, I mean, we were discussing evolution and how natural selection plays a pivotal role in crafting these organisms non-directionally. But a lot of people still don't really, even when they talk about evolution and Darwinian natural selection, they still have this sort of Lamarckian view of what this is. And I think that tends to blur the reality. What does any of your research or work has to say about that?
Well, interestingly, yeah. So a Lamarckian view of evolution, that is, you can kind of will things to change, or, the giraffe stretches its neck and the baby giraffes have longer necks. Okay, that doesn't work. The bodybuilders don't have children with bigger muscles, right? Or the Jewish rite of circumcision for thousands of years, they've been cutting off the foreskin of little babies, and babies are still born with foreskins, even in Jewish families. So it doesn't change the germline at all. But that is our intuition, and we know this from research by cognitive psychologists. See, I think I have his forthcoming book here. Anyway, it escapes me at the moment the title of his book is, but the idea is if you ask people if they accept the theory of evolution, most students say, yeah, of course. Describe it. How does it work? And most people don't know how it works. They invoke something like a Lamarckian explanation. So when they're saying they believe in evolution, they're really just kind of publicly signaling, I trust the science. I guess those scientists know what they're doing. They usually get it right. So everyone seems to think evolution's true. So yeah, okay, I accept it. Stuhlman, Andrew Stuhlman he's a psychologist at Occidental College, Andrew Stuhlman. And this was part of his research. What do people understand about evolution? And they really don't understand it. That kind of population genetics thinking, it's just counterintuitive. And it turns out this is true for most things. If you want to broaden the model a little bit, if you ask people, what their opinion is on NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, people go, oh yeah, I accept it, or no, I'm against it. Okay, what is it? Oh, it's that thing, with I don't even know what countries it is, but I'm against it. They're mostly publicly signaling what their party says about it, or their candidate, or whatever the latest trend is in their tribe, to accept it or reject it. And that turns out to be true across the board. I mean, most people don't understand most things. And how could you? I mean, most of these issues are complex, and who has time? Most of us are just trying to lead our lives. So, much of what we accept as true, or we don't accept it as true, is based on what the people around us think. It's sort of a, pull the audience to find out what's true. And most of the time that's a reasonable way of understanding nature and reality is, what are other people doing? Yeah. And if they're doing something, if they're running away from something, maybe I better run away too, just in case, because they know something I don't know. And usually that works. So, a lot of these classic psych experiments, it's kind of guerrilla theater from the 1960s and 70s, where we're going to set up a thing in the elevator where everybody faces backwards. Yeah. And then everybody's a shill for the experiment. Let's see what happens when the person gets on the elevator. It's like a candid camera. Ha ha ha. They all conform to the crowd. This is so dumb. Look how stupid they are and conforming. Pumping smoke in the room, and everybody in the room is a shill except the one guy, and he's sitting there filling out his form going, well, no one else is doing anything. I guess I'll just sit here like an idiot. Well, but in a way, social proof is a generally reliable method, because if there really was smoke coming in the room, there really was a fire in the building, people wouldn't just be sitting there filling out a form because the experimenter told them to. They'd really get up and move. And then the subject would go, yeah, I'm out of here too. So it's not stupid. We're not irrational in that sense.
It's a well-adapted feature of ours.
Yes, and for the most part, it usually works. It's good enough for understanding the world.
And I think, so one of the great ways to try and avoid this, being easily influenced by others, and by allowing certain game theories to almost absorb your entire life, is to do what you call Skepticism 101. And I think, you literally teach this as a course at university. How can we better think about concepts in general And I think it's important for the listeners and viewers to understand exactly what you're doing there, because people are just assuming this is just, okay, maintaining that cynicism you discussed earlier. But it's not. You're actually teaching them tools and tricks to think. It's almost like intuition pumps that Daniel Dennett talks about, but for everything.
Yeah, that's right. So I'm trying to teach my students how to think about things, not just what to think, because I don't know what's going to come down the pike 10 years from now that they encounter in the news, and how should they think about it? I don't know. So, I mean, they don't know, but after they take my course, they'll think, oh yeah, right. I should be skeptical until the evidence is strong. I should apportion my beliefs to the power of the evidence. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Watch out for anomaly hunting and the file drawer problem, where all the negative results get filed away, and we only see the published positive results. The counterfactuals, what else would have to be true if this was true? And let's run some counterfactual experiments, just things like that. So I have 15 weeks of these different tools that we go through. And, it's just a useful way of how to think about the world. Steve Pinker has a similar course at Harvard called Rationality. His book is called Rationality. And same kind of thing, statistical theory, signal detection theory, Bayesian reasoning, logic, all the logical fallacies, cognitive biases. All these things are tools that are handy to have. And they have, for the most part, trickled down, I think, to the general population. You'll hear people talking about their priors. Oh, I'm going to adjust my priors and change my credence. Whoa, are you? Do you know the mathematics behind that? Most people don't. I even have to look it up. Like, what was the formula again? Okay, I'm going to lecture on this tomorrow. I better bone up on what that Bayesian equation was again, and so on. But the general idea, don't assign a 0 or a 1, just something in between 1 and 99, and just adjust your beliefs up or down based on new evidence that comes in. So, I get hammered on social media for, why are you so skeptical of these UAPs? Haven't you heard those stories? They're incredible stories. Like, well, first of all, I've been doing this for 30 years, and I've heard these every year for 30 years, and not once have they ever come true. And the evidence is no better than it ever was. It's the same old blurry videos and grainy photographs and stories about things in the sky. You got to do better than that. I'm willing to, change my mind. If Marco Rubio gets into one of those warehouses where the spacecraft and the alien non-human biologics are located, and he comes out and goes, oh my God, you're not going to believe this. We have the aliens. Here it is. And he shows his pictures, and here's the video, and takes the camera crew in there. Look, here they are. We're the government is going to admit we have these. Okay, I would accept that in the same way I did the Chinese spy balloon. I never saw the Chinese spy balloon myself. It didn't fly over Southern California, but I accept that the media and the military and the Pentagon and the president and everybody that covered that story, they got it right, even though I didn't see it personally myself. And so that's what it would take.
Yeah. I mean, so you mentioned briefly that we've got these psychological tools, like these biases, we can practice and train on those. Philosophical ones like logical fallacies, we can understand those. I'm curious to know if this is probably a difficult question to answer, but do you think you'd be able to give us like a top 5 logical fallacies to avoid and a top 5 cognitive biases to sort of also embrace or?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, I mean, the biggest mother of all cognitive biases is the motivated reasoning, it's called. That is, we're motivated to reason our way toward being right, rather than finding out what's true. So this is based on a theory by Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber. And this is by no means universally accepted, but there's kind of 2 schools of thought on this. Why did we evolve the capacity to reason and use rationality and so on? I mentioned tracking and hunting and so on. Is it that we want a veridical perception apparatus and system where the goal of our sensory apparatus and reasoning about the information that comes in is to better understand reality the way it really is? Or is it something else, which is what Mercier and Sperber argue, which is that we really evolved the capacity to reason to win arguments, to be right, for our group, our tribe, to be correct, and to support that through reason and arguments and evidence and so on. And so the confirmation bias, you look for confirming evidence for what you believe, and you disregard the disconfirming evidence, or you rationalize away, spin doctor the negative evidence or whatever against your hypothesis in order to win, to be right. And that's their argument. And I think there's something to both sides.
Yeah.
Clearly, we have the capacity to understand the nature of reality reasonably well. And I know this because, you and I can both look at this thing and go, yeah, it's round. I can feel it, and you can see it, and you and I can agree, and we get some confirmation. Maybe we ask a third person or a fourth person, and we get corroboration on this. We could all be deluded, but it's not likely. And it's reasonable for me, apply the Copernican principle. I'm not special, that your brain and sensory apparatus works the same as mine. There's nothing special about me. So if you say you see something and I see something and we agree on it, it's probably the way it is. Then the counterexamples is, well, the bat, the bat has a completely different sensory apparatus. It uses, this sonar system and so on. And it's whatever this thing looks like to the brain of a bat, it's probably very different from what you and I see. That's true. But if the bat is flying toward this object and it's bouncing sound waves off of it and picking them up, it's still going to avoid it. It's going to go around it. Why? Because it's really there. Right. So something like that, even though the icon in its brain is going to be different than the icon in my occipital lobe or the visual cortex or whatever, it's still really there, and the reason, say, camouflage works in nature is because there really are organisms that are dangerous, and the other organisms that evolve systems to either look like it or to camouflage against it is because they really are there. So there really are predators, and those colors really do matter, and so forth. So all that, I guess my conclusion would be that we're able to reason relatively well to understand the way the world really is, but not perfectly so. We're never going to be sure because of all the cognitive biases, the hindsight bias, after the fact, you reconstruct what happened and conclude that it had to happen that way. Confirmation bias, the my side bias, this would support Mercier's argument that that our side is right, our political party, our religion, whatever it is, our tribe, but knowing that, you can just go, well, okay, I'm probably subject to so there's a bias. We can be, so there's bias training. You train subjects on to do what you just asked me to do. Okay, here's the top 5 things you should look out for. Okay, I got it. And the way it works is they become very good at seeing other people's biases, but they have a hard time seeing it in their own reasoning. So that's called the bias. So we got to get a bias to overcome the bias, right? And that's never going to happen 100%. So, so then you have to develop tools of sort of meta tools, like, well, what's the overall goal here? And okay, I'm aware of my side bias and the confirmation bias and my motivated reasoning. So therefore, I'm going to set as my goal, I just want to know what's actually true, not what my tribe thinks is true. I'm a Republican, or I'm a Democrat, or I'm a Catholic, or I'm a Jew, or a Protestant, whatever. I'm going to just decide what's actually true. That's my goal. And so with that, you can overcome some of those biases. It really does work. I mean, there's a reason for all those courses in logic and logical fallacies and all that stuff. People can be trained around it. And the scientific method itself, the way it's set up, we got to have a blinded condition, so the subjects don't know which condition they're in, because that could influence the outcome. Yeah, but the experimenter bias, okay, it's going to be double blind. The experimenter doesn't even know what condition the subjects are in, and so these are they use coded coded words or codes to mark the subjects, and you don't know which condition the subject is in when you're sitting there recording what they're doing or whatever, so that you're not biased, but somebody else could decode it and figure out who was in which group and then run the statistics on it, things like that. The randomized controlled trials, the reason for those is because of all those problems in the cognitive biases and logical fallacies and so on built into the system. So the randomized controlled trial, again, you don't know which condition the subject is in, and they don't know if they're getting the placebo or the actual drug, and so on. All that's done, and then you run the experiment later, the statistics, and go, okay, it looks like this drug works or it doesn't work or whatever. And all that took a long time to develop. I mean, really, even all the way up till 2010, when the replication crisis struck, and we discovered that probably half of all psych experiments and a good portion of medical research was not replicable. It probably should have never been published. How did it get published? Well, the p-hacking, for example, the p-value, the probability of it being due to chance rather than the effect you're looking at. It turns out you can manipulate the data in a way. You throw out the extreme values to make the numbers come out a certain way. Even unconsciously, experimenters maybe do this. And so this kind of p-hacking, and again, I mentioned the file drawer problem. The experimenter runs 9 experiments and one of them is statistically significant, so that's the one that gets published, but no one knows about the other 8 that failed to be statistically significant. That would be good to know. So now there's these sites where you post ahead of time. Here are the experiments I'm going to run. Here's all 9 of them, and I'm going to report the results of all 9 right here. So everybody knows ahead of time what's going on. Things like that. I mean, that's pretty recent. That's just 13 years ago. And so science is relatively new and stumbling along, trying to figure out what are we getting wrong. And it's if I knew what our cultural biases were, I wouldn't be subject to them. But I don't know. I'm like the fish. We're all like the fish in the water. I don't even know that there's water. If I knew, I wouldn't be subject to it. And, so on that bigger picture of extraterrestrials or God or whatever, I mean, yes, reality could be completely different. As Avi Loeb likes to say, 95% of the universe is unknown. It's, dark energy, dark matter. We don't even know what it is. It's like, okay, so maybe we should be humble, epistemologically humble, epistemological humility before the fact, just in case. I don't want to be that guy in 1896 that said physics is pretty much done.
Yes.
Yeah, we got it all figured out, right? And then along comes Einstein and quantum physics and relativity, and like, oh, well, And so I don't know. 500 years from now, we could all be thinking very differently, in the same way that if you time travel back to Newton's time, and you showed him general relativity and quantum physics, he'd be like, what?
Knowing Newton, he probably would figure it out at some point.
Yeah, because he was smart enough. Yeah.
Tell me, Michael, what's your perception of the relationship between philosophy and science? Does science need philosophy and vice versa?
Oh, yeah. Science is really a branch of philosophy. Philosophy is just a larger worldview of approaching the world using every tool that we have, one of which is science. So I don't make this distinction between science and philosophy. And science progresses and philosophy makes no progress. This is just the wrong way to think about it.
And mathematical realism?
Well, okay. So that's different kinds of truths. We want to talk about that. There's certain mathematical truths in a Euclidean geometry. The sum of the angles of a triangle and so on and so forth. These are just true by mathematical reasoning. Or, a bachelor is an unmarried man. Okay, it's just what the word means. Those are different than the kind of stuff we've been talking about, where we don't know for sure. I do think, does mathematics represent something that's really out there? I think for the most part, yes. I think that's right. I mean, whatever the aliens, if we encounter aliens, they will have surely figured out math, because how else could they achieve the physics of space flight and so on without figuring those things out? Now, but of course they're going to call it something different. They're not going to call it F equals ma or whatever. They're going to use some other symbols or something. But the assumption, this uniformitarian assumption, is that physics in some other galaxy works the same way as it does here. Or physics a billion years ago is the same as it is now. It's possible that's not the case, but the assumption is a reasonable one to make. And so, again, back to what the aliens might be like. Well, if they're on a planet like ours with a certain level of gravity, and certain density of air and so on. They're going to have certain structures because that's just the physics of it. And assuming that physics works, gravity works the same way as it does here in some other galaxy, it's a reasonable assumption. So yeah, I think mathematics maps onto reality. I don't know how far you want to go with that. When someone like Max Tegmark, he's just beyond my cognitive capacity to understand what, the entire universe is mathematical. I don't even sure I even know what that means.
I mean, math's a difficult concept to grasp in general when you take certain fields of mathematics, and then to say that it takes it to another level.
I think so. Yeah, I think metaphysically, so kind of locked into our concepts. Very much determines the way we think about things in that Wittgenstein way. The concept as it's defined. And I think we end up hitting an epistemological wall, certain hard problems, like the hard problem of consciousness. The fact that we still don't have an answer, and I see my friend Christoph Koch had to pay David Chalmers for their 25-year bet.
You gave him a very good rack of wines, eh? Very
yes. I read that. Yeah. Way to go, Christoph. And okay. But I'm not sure it could ever be resolved in the same way of free will determinism. It's like it may be a conceptual problem, the way it's just conceived, the way you're defining these words. You end up with just this word salad of arguments that seem to get nowhere. I get my own point.
I think so. That's exactly what this. At some point, that's how I framed this entire conversation. So I told you via email that a great way to apply your work to this would be we approach the basic concepts of this podcast. So, Mind-Body Solution explores the nature of reality, consciousness, free will, morality, mental health, and more. But I think the best way, the overarching theme of this is obviously paying homage to the infamous mind-body problem. I mean, how is it possible that this psychological system can manifest? I mean, it comes from this biological being. And I've noticed on the Michael Shermer Show, I mean, you've interviewed many similar guests. I mean, you've got Donald Hoffman, Ogi Ogas, Bernardo Kastrup, so many people that we've both spoken to. So I'm curious to know at this point, let's start with consciousness, applying that skepticism to what these theories have to say. I mean, we've got hardcore materialists. I consider myself one of them, but at this point, I mean, the hardcore part's slowly fading away. And it's the more I'm talking to these guys, I'm seeing what they're trying to say from a philosophical, mathematical, or neuroscientific perspective. Oh, well, I wouldn't say neuroscientific because they go beyond that. But I'm still grounded in that materialist belief. How do you, when you chat to these guys, how do you feel? And what comes to mind?
Well, the mind-body problem itself, just the way it's phrased, is a kind of a dualistic assumption. Well, there's body, and then there's this other thing called mind. Well, you're using that word, but it's just a word. What does it mean? It's to me, it's just a word that describes what the brain is doing when it's doing something. In the same way, like that's what when your brain dies, where does the mind go? That'd be like asking when your heart stops beating, where does the heartbeat go? There is no heartbeat without the heart beating. It's the word heartbeat just describes what the heart is doing, or where the liver is doing cleaning your blood, and the pancreas is doing that, whatever that is. I always forget. That's just a process of a physical system. And to me, this word mind has been elevated to something other than all these other processes. And I just don't think it should be. I think that's a mistake, a conceptual mistake. It's still that kind of intuitive dualism. Paul Bloom writes about this, that, we're natural born dualists. Children from the youngest age, you can test them, assume there's something else. You have the little puppet of the mouse and the puppet of the alligator, and the alligator puppet munches the mouse alligator. Where is the mouse now? Oh, it's off in this other realm, and it's with its mommy, and it's scared. Children from a very young age think there's some essence, essentialism. There's an essence to the thing other than the body, the physical structure. And that seems to be infusing everything we talk about, all of our language. And so, free will, like there's this mini me inside me, and so on. It's hard to get around that. And, I don't have the answer to the mind body, but nobody does. I think it's a conceptual difficulty. But for me, there's no problem because physical systems act on physical systems. That's what they do. And that's what we do when we're studying physical systems, and how, one thing causes another thing. So neurons firing cause other neurons to fire. and neural networks are at work and they interact with other neural networks. Sometimes they're conflicting, sometimes they're reinforcing, whatever. They build these models of the world, and models on top of models on top of models that get more complex. And at some point it feels like there's something else metaphysical going on. I mean, when we're just sitting here talking, I hear the words coming out of my mouth, but I don't know. I can't sense any of the process going on in my brain. You don't detect your brain. It feels like there's thoughts floating around up there in some kind of quantum field or some airy-fairy, metaphysical field. But that's not, we know that's not true. They're just neurons firing. My Broca's area, that generates speech, and this other area that, generates the thoughts, and my fears and emotions bubble up from my amygdala, and my prefrontal cortex puts the brakes on by getting upset at you for asking me this question, so I won't yell at you, whatever. There's all this stuff going on, but I don't perceive any of it. It just feels like there's this stuff floating around up there. So to me, the mind body, how does the mind act on the body? There is no mind. It's just, how does the body act on the body? Well, it just does. That's what it does. My brain stem sends these signals to my heart and lungs to beat and breathe. I don't have to think about it, thank God. And it happens when you're sleeping and so on. And when general anesthesia, kicks in, it alters these things, and they have to have systems set up to make so you keep breathing and your heart keeps pumping while you're getting surgery and all this stuff. It's all body. It's just the brain. The mind is just a word to describe what the brain does. That's my answer to the problem.
When I try to chat about this to someone who has a fundamentally different view, I try to maintain that, as we were discussing earlier, that relatively skeptical approach mentally, but I think it's important to try and explore the idea so that we can also understand the philosophy behind it. When you approached conversations with people like Donald Hoffman, Bernardo Kastrup, who have an idealist perspective, consciousness is fundamental. The other day I spoke to Thomas Campbell. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work. He also says, consciousness is fundamental. So this idealist perspective, when you approach these conversations, grounded in a materialist perspective, how do you go about it?
Yeah, well, like with Deepak Chopra, who's, I've known a long time now. He's of that bent that everything is consciousness. Consciousness is the ground of all being, as he says, in the same way that, Tillich said God is the ground of all being. In a way, it's kind of a theological position to take, that, metaphysically, there's something that underlies everything that we see and measure and so on. And that underlying thing is what? Consciousness, God, whatever, some metaphysical other thing. And okay, maybe, I don't know. It seems like you hit one of these epistemological walls where, well, how can we settle this issue? Is there some experiment we're going to run? And it often, to me, seems like it comes down to like a leap of faith. Like, this is my metaphysical presumption. This is where I'm going to start. Okay, just put that up front so we know that. And from that, you can derive all sorts of things. But if you start with some other grounding point, then you're not going to end up with those assumptions. This is why I like that survey Chalmers did back in 2009. It's been replicated since then by somebody else. They just surveyed, it was something like 3,600 professors and graduate students in philosophy on, like the top 20 problems in philosophy. What is your position, like free will and determinism and so on. And the fact that there's very little consensus on most of these hard problems. They don't agree with each other. And to me, this would be like surveying astronomers and cosmologists. Is it the Big Bang theory or the steady state theory that explains the cosmos? Well, 99% of them say, well, Big Bang has won out over the steady state because of all this evidence that's accumulated since the 1950s. But if it was still 50-50 or, something like it, we don't know. And I'd say, okay, maybe there's, and it was instead of a 50-year-old problem, it was a 1,000-year-old problem. I'd think, okay, you guys you're going about this the wrong way. There's something else wrong with the way you're asking the question. Because at some point, if there's a way to get an answer, well, then you should be able to run some experiments and figure out which is the likeliest one to be true. Now, there's still Big Bang skeptics, I know, but not many. And so you get this consensus. And the fact that there doesn't seem to be as much consensus in philosophy as there is in science tells me there's some other thing going on there.
Yeah.
And again, I think it's that metaphysical starting point. I'm going to start where at the assumption everything is conscious, like something like panpsychism or something. Okay, then you're going to end up somewhere different.
That's true. I think that also indicates the limits within science, because philosophy does allow you to, at least semantically or linguistically, explore concepts that go beyond science. And I think that's the reason why, because some philosophers of mind who have these different perspectives from our own, I mean, they formulate some well-grounded philosophical arguments to a point where it becomes very difficult to really find flaws within it. And in essence, its explanatory power slightly increases from a philosophical perspective and not from a scientific perspective. And I find that quite interesting and fascinating. And that's why this mind-body problem really is, well, a hard problem at least. It's quite a difficult one to answer.
Yeah. And okay, so what's wrong with that line of reasoning where I'm going to just do a pure thought experiment? If I'm going to start here, and if this is true, then this, and if then, and 20 steps later, you end up at where you're at. Okay, did you look out the window to see if any of that is true? I mean, if you're just in your head the entire time, there's nothing wrong with that. Philosophy is a perfectly reasonable way of reasoning. But it would be nice if you could somehow test it. Like, what is nature actually like? So that, like Deepak's thing, everything is consciousness is pervasive in the universe. And so they said, well, what about, when somebody gets a stroke, that area, that form of consciousness, that area of the mind itself just is gone. They can't speak anymore. Their memories are gone. My thought experiment for Deepak was, where does Aunt Millie's mind go when her brain dies of Alzheimer's? And Deepak's answer, I guess this is the idealist position, well, it just goes to where it returns to where it started. It goes back into the ether, whatever. And that Aunt Millie's brain was just a temporary instantiation of her consciousness that exists somewhere else. Well, where is that? And then the analogy, well, the brain is like a radio receiver and consciousness is like the radio waves, So here we are in my office here in Santa Barbara. We have radio stations. If I had a radio here, I could tune it in. I don't have a radio in my office. There's one in my car. But if I could tune it in here, I could hear it, but I don't have one here. So we don't detect the radio signals, but they're here. Okay, so my answer to that is, okay, but we know where the radio stations are. You can go there. You can see the guy in the booth talking to the microphone, and then the transmitters are sending it out, and they go to the towers at the top of the hill here, and they broadcast out to the world and so on. I can see the apparatus. Where's the equivalent of that for universal consciousness? What is there some consciousness creating mechanism somewhere in the universe where all this stuff comes from? And the answer appears to be no, it's just pervasive everywhere. Okay, then how do you know it's true? I mean, if there's no way to falsify it, to test it, to go, let's go look, then again, you're just saying, this is my metaphysical starting point, and then to me, it sounds like a leap of faith. I'm just going to start here. Okay.
Yeah, because it does become quite difficult, especially if you are relying on this empirical evidence for us to fully grasp those concepts, because we need some sort of empirical reality to test this. And also, I think then at that point, it would also lack some sort of practical significance, which I think then makes it less useful from a scientific perspective. But then I've also, again, with this, I've noticed philosophical arguments where they're able to give you the practical significance, and makes it a bit difficult. Yeah,
that's always, to me, it's always a good question. Why does this matter? What difference does it make? Like I listened to your conversation with Noam Chomsky. I thought it was great. He's such an interesting guy. I'm not crazy about his politics, but he's pretty deep thinker philosophically. And
that's at 93, Michael. That's at 93. That's crazy.
What's not? Yeah. Oh, I know. He's 93 years. Unbelievable. Yeah. So, but on the free will determinism, you were pushing him on that. But I loved his just single line. What difference does it make? No one actually believes in determinism. Even the determinists, the moment they walk out of their office and go out in the world, they don't act determined. They act like they're free.
He's like, what about the main one? Common sense.
Common sense, right? Yeah. What does it seem like? Yes, okay. I could be determined, but I'm the determining factor of my own physical system. Again, back to that mind-body problem. In a way, I am part of the causal net of the universe. I'm a physical being in a physical universe. Yes. but I can also affect the physical universe around me by the choices I make, including myself. I can affect my future self by choices I make now. Oh, well, but that was determined by your genes and your upbringing and the contingent events that happened the day before and last month and 1 hour ago, whatever. Okay. Yeah, but I'm part of that. I'm interacting with all of that. That's part of me, and anyway, so I'll be having this conversation with Robert Sapolsky next month. He's got a big book coming out on determinism.
Yeah. It's called Determined, I think, eh?
Determined, yeah.
Very exciting.
Yeah, I just want to ask him, okay, when you go outside, do you look left before you cross the street? I mean, come on.
There's a book that came out, that's coming out, on the 3rd of October. It's called, is by Kevin Mitchell, Free Agents. It's based on the evolution of consciousness. So that's something I think you should check out. It's very good.
Right.
Very.
Right. Again, I get these books every week in my office here. I have just hundreds of books stacked up behind me. And there's a lot of books on determinism and free will. I mean, making the argument, a book length. I mean, big, thick books.
Yeah.
Making the argument that determinism is true, or compatibilism, mostly not libertarian free will, but compatibilism is the preferred position. Making super strong arguments, and I read them both and go, "That's a good argument." And then I read the other one, it's like, "That's a good argument." It's like, okay, so back to back to the bigger picture. Then, how can we figure out who's right?
Yeah.
And the answer may be
are we determined to figure this out?
It may come down to what Chomsky said. It's just, just go outside and just walk around and think what's actually going on here. I am making decisions. I am free. Okay, technically you're not free to do anything. I mean, I can't play NBA basketball. Okay. We're not talking about that, but just, should I have the chocolate chip cookies this afternoon or not? I have some say in that matter, even though I'm tempted. And like another one of my questions I have for people, determinists, is the person that is subject to the opioid crisis, somebody who has true addictions. They really can't. They have a difficult time controlling their urges, and this has been a huge problem. But we know that actually that affects a small percentage of people who have taken opioids. It's like 1%, are having such strong addictions they cannot control themselves, and then they have serious medical problems or death. Okay, but I don't have that problem. Like my father was an alcoholic. One of my two sisters is alcoholic. My father's father, my grandfather, was an alcoholic. One of his two brothers was an alcoholic, but I'm not. I can drink 1, 2, 3. I can stop at any time. I don't care. It doesn't really matter. And lucky me. Okay, so I don't feel like I have super willpower or whatever. But to the determinist, what does that mean? The addict is more determined and I'm less determined? Can you say I just have more degrees of freedom and they have fewer degrees of freedom? You can just reframe it that way in terms of volition, which is what Dan Dennett does in Freedom Evolves. Which I really like that book. Just more. Just think of degrees of freedom of a machine. Most machines are restricted in their degrees of freedom, how much they can move, or what choices they can make, or whatever. And in sports, for example, I was thinking about this with I've been playing tennis a lot in the last year, and the degrees of freedom is too wide for my control, and therefore I'm not a very good player. But the more practice I have and the more lessons I take, I'm able to restrict the degrees of freedom so that the serve is more consistent every single time. And I've noticed the professionals, they all have these kind of obsessive little tics that they do. They bounce the ball just the right number of times, and they do this with the hair, and then this, that, and the arm, and the jersey, and they're trying to restrict the degrees of freedom so they have fewer errors, or it's just the same every shot, right? And in a way, that's a good way to think about human behaviors, is degrees of freedom. And I would say that the addict just has fewer degrees of freedom. They just can't control the behavior as much as rather than saying they're more determined or less determined, which I think is a weird way to say it. Anyway.
This is the thing with this topic. There's, as you said, there's so many arguments back and forth. It's very convincing sometimes. When you read an opposing argument. I mean, have you read Just Desserts by Dennett and Greg Caruso?
I had the two of them on the show.
Yes, I think I as well. Yes.
Yeah, and it's like at the end, it's like, okay, those are both great arguments.
Yeah, what do you do?
But where are we? We're back to where we started 2 hours ago.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. I mean, he comes with a hard compatibilist take, and then, I mean, you've got Dennett who's got the compatibilist take within it, but then they're both still making one assumption there, is that it's determined. Everything is determined. And then you've got people making a completely different argument. And these are very intelligent people making different claims. Where do you stand at this? Do you have a position?
Yeah, well, I think I like the idea of self-determined. I think that's the title of the book, in fact, in which you can actually, this was by a psychologist, a clinician, I think, who trains people on how to control their urges, addicts and cigarette smoking and whatever. And that you can actually do this. People learn to control their emotions and their addictions and their predilections in the same way of, what do they call it? A violence training, or what is it? Aggressive, people that have self-control issues with violence.
So,
anger management. Okay. So you just train people. Okay. When you feel this urge coming up, here's what you got to, count to 10, walk outside, stop the conversation. There's just certain tools you can have at the ready. And people do learn to do this. They really do. Addicts really do control their urges, and cigarette smokers stop smoking. Alcoholics stop drinking. It's harder for them, but so when you train them and they learn it and they actually do it, what is going on there? They're gaining more self-control. They're determining their future self. I think a useful way to think about it is our current self and our future self. It's sort of a weird thing, but we all do it. Like, where do I want to be tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, 10 years from now? And I can project that, thanks to the fact we have a big cortex. It's really the fact that we can project into the future is probably what makes us different from other species who can project a little bit into the future, an hour maybe, but we can project infinitely. Yeah. And it's like that episode of Simpsons where Homer's about to drink his 23rd beer or whatever, and his Marge says, you're going to regret that tomorrow. And he goes, that's future Homer's problem. Man, I don't, that poor sucker, like it's somebody else, and so there's lots of examples of this. There's apps you can get, where you, kind of write down or project publicly what your goals are, so that now you feel more motivated to go, I want to lose this many pounds this month. And you tell your friends, and by doing that, you're sort of pressuring yourself, right? To when the temptation comes, well, darn it, I'd really like that cookie, but I told my wife, I told my friends, I announced on Twitter, that I'm going to lose 10 pounds this month. So I got to do it, and there's just lots of examples of that. Like just anticipate. So here's your self-control. Like tomorrow's Tuesday morning, the guys leave at 7 a.m. at the pier here in Santa Barbara on our morning bike ride. They ride down to Ventura and back 50 miles round trip. They leave at 7. And they don't wait for me. So, I got to set the alarm. I know what future Michael is going to be like at 5 a.m. I'm not going to like it. Set the alarm. But if I have my bike clothes already out, and I got the coffee machine ready to go, and my water bottle is already filled and in the fridge, the bike is in the back of the car ready to go, tires are pumped up, and so on, then I know that future Shermer is going to be weak at 5 a.m. and not want to do those things, and I'm going to miss the ride. So the night before, I take all these steps so that future Shermer doesn't have this problem. That's basically a model for everything that we do. I don't want to do this, so I better do that. I better make these changes now for future. And, this is what, libertarian paternalism is all about. Most people are not good at this. So, I don't know, some huge 60% of Americans or something have no money for savings for retirement. None. And some even larger percentage would not even be able to take like a $400 hit in a month where they had like a medical emergency. They don't even have $400 to saved up to cover some unforeseen expense. That's a failure of projecting yourself into your future. Well, what can we do about that? Well, this is what libertarian paternalism, Dick Thaler's theory that he was part of the Obama administration, where choice architecture, right? So companies will withhold, well, first of all, the government withholds your taxes, your money before you see it, right? Before withholding was invented by the IRS, people would actually deposit their entire paycheck and then have to write a check to the government. Well, the compliance was much lower because you can see it. There it is. It's in my bank account. No, I have to give it away.
Yeah.
But if it's taken out of the paycheck before you even see it, right? Withholding. That makes people feel less bad about taxes, right? So, corporations are now big corporations. You have a retirement account. Now, maybe you only work there for a year or 5 years or whatever. You still get some of it. But they know people are bad about this. So they're going to just withhold some of your paycheck every month. And we're going to take $100 a month and we're going to put it in this, S&P 500 indexed mutual fund for you. And when you're done here, whenever that is, you get the money. Plus all the interest that accrued on it. And the stock market goes up or down, whatever it does. And there's variations of this. You can have a high risk one where maybe you have tech stocks, a low risk one where you have the big cap industrial companies. Maybe you just have bonds that are guaranteed to go up, 1% a year or something. And because that's your preference. So you get to choose, right? So this is the libertarian paternal. This is the libertarian part, right? Or, menus are designed along this line where, the kind of rich, sugary desserts at the back of the menu and the healthy stuff, or the cafeteria layout for kids, in high school. The healthy stuff is at the front of the line where you're going down with your tray, and the desserts are at the end of the line. There's just hundreds of examples like this. Here, I'll show you my driver's license here from California is another example. Here we go. So you'll see a little red dot there next to my face.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So that is me opting in to give my organs away if I'm killed. But my organs are still working to somebody who needs my heart or lungs or whatever. And so I had to opt in for that. Otherwise, I'm not donating my organs. In Oregon, north of us here in California, you are donating your organs unless you punch the tab on the driver's license that says I'm opting out. So Oregon has a much higher rate of organ donation than California, just by the choice architecture of opt-in versus opt-out. Okay, all of this comes from this whole free will determinism thing. There's something in between. We're not free to do anything, of course, but you can nudge people and you can nudge yourself, knowing these things to change your future behavior. Well, who is doing that? You are. Well, you is a delusion. There is no self. Oh, come on. Okay, maybe technically there is no self up there somewhere. It's a whole bunch of neural networks, whatever. But again, just look out the window. Common sense. When you're walking around, don't you feel like you're a self and people treat you like you are a person? Yeah. So
my quick question is it safe to actually show your driver's license? I just want to make sure.
Oh, I don't care.
Just making sure.
Oh, you mean for
for view
ID. Okay, maybe we better blur that out.
I'll cut that out for you.
Yeah, just in case it showed my driver's license number, I guess.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the implications would be, so I'll just cut that out just in case.
Okay, all right. but you get the point.
Yeah. So Michael, I think the fascinating thing about. Sorry, continue.
Well, so you think about all these things. What is your answer to all these problems? How do you think about it?
It's such a difficult one because from a medical perspective, when I treat patients, I try and think about, okay, do I really apply that? Because there was a very big chunk of my life where I did perceive determinism as the argument and the conclusion for me. I thought this is an illusion. I even came into consciousness with that perspective. When I first, before starting the podcast, I even wrote in my dissertation on illusionism as a theory of consciousness, defended Daniel Dennett, Keith Frankish, all the illusionists, and I used psychiatry to back this up. Since starting the podcast, that view is completely changed. I have no idea where I stand. I label the mind-body solution with the passionate curiosity, but I always say take one step closer to the solution rather than say we'll find the solution, because that level of skepticism is always there. I think it's too big a problem. I think not even a problem. I agree with you that even saying mind-body problem creates that dichotomy that I still don't think we understand, and we shouldn't even be making with so much fervor and tenacity. So I always say one step closer to the mind-body solution, but I also don't want to say I'm a Mysterian in the sense that I think we'll never figure this out. But I don't think we will. That's the tough one. Have you read a book called Conscious Mind, Resonant Brain by Stephen Grossberg?
No, I don't know that one.
So Stephen Grossberg, he's an emeritus professor at Boston, and a lot of colleagues in the field, a lot of neuroscientists call this guy the Einstein of the mind. the Newton of the brain. And they say this with so much, they mean it. They legitimately say this like he's one of the brightest men of our time. He wrote a book when he was around 17 on consciousness. And just do it. I'm not even going to destroy this wonderful piece of art, but I want you to read it at some point if you ever get the chance. But there's certain neuroscientific theories of consciousness that I've noticed that really, really are doing an amazing job. Most of them incorporate a lot of physics and mathematics at this point. But my biggest concern with that is we've always done this. We've always had this way of using the latest science to explain phenomena. So pumps and vessels at one point. I mean, consciousness was merely that. And we continuously do this, which is why initially I came to the illusionist argument. I think Dennett's approach to philosophy and science in general was very good for scientists and philosophers to realize that you have to incorporate the neuroscience to the philosophy. There's probably this element there. Well, what are your thoughts on? So in consciousness?
Yeah, I think. Well, I think in general, neuroscience is still a fairly new field. When I was in undergraduate at Pepperdine, I took a course in physiological psychology. There was no neuroscience. That was it. And it's like, well, what's this? Okay. Oh, I see neurons and the neural system in the brain. And it's like, all right, yeah, I guess this is important. And that was just the 70s. That's not that long ago.
Yeah.
The long history of science, physics goes back, hundreds of years, 400 or 500 years. We have a long ways to go. So I suspect, centuries from now, maybe 400 or 500 years from now, if we came back, we were chronically frozen and woken up going, oh, we didn't know this, and that explains the mind-body problem or the hard problem of consciousness. We're not even asking it that way. We're asking it this completely new way. Oh, I see. Yeah, that makes more sense. But if I knew what that was, I would implement it, but I don't. Yeah. I just don't know how people are going to conceive of it. I mean, you mentioned this book I didn't know. There's a lot of books on this, and maybe this guy's got it right, but maybe not. I don't know. But maybe there'll be somebody, another Newton of the mind, in a century from now. And and he'll figure it out, or she'll figure it out, whatever. So I don't know.
I was going to touch on. Sorry, I didn't really answer your question though. But in terms of the free will debate, I mean, when I practice with patients, I find it very difficult to then apply those theories as we were just discussing. It's impossible. It's very difficult to apply that practically to a patient. If you're trying to change someone, make their life better somehow, you can't just tell them that reality controls everything. And there's nothing you can do. No. I mean, it just does not work practically. So there is that morality/ethical dilemma, practical dilemma that we have to face. And I mean, obviously, that's something we're going to have to touch on. In terms of the free will debate, what is your understanding of its implications on morality? And
well, the research on that is pretty clear now. I think that people that are primed to consider the determinist position as the correct one then feel they have less personal responsibility, less accountability for their moral actions. They feel like there's no point in trying to do things because it's all determined. I don't think it's a good position to take. The implications of what you believe does not make something true or false, but it certainly suggests strongly that what people believe matters in terms of their behavior, and believing that you have some volition and you can do something about your life does make people more likely to do something about their lives, right? So again, these clinical psychologists that work in this field, that like addiction and cigarette smoking and things like that, self-control, they definitely present a model in which you can change. And here are the patients I've worked with that have changed their lives. Testimonials, they have databases of this, that people really do gain more self-control by understanding what the causal vectors are. Causal vectors, influencing vectors, or something that shapes their lives, and knowing that you can do something about it. Maybe not every time. There are still people dying of the opioid crisis because they just can't control themselves. They just try and try, they just can't do it. The rest of us are paying for that in a way. This is another part of this debate about painkillers. There's a lot of people that need painkillers are now having a hard time getting them because the doctors are afraid of getting sued, and somebody keels over dead, the authorities are coming after them because of what happened with the Purdue Pharmaceutical and the Sacker family and all the lies about the addictiveness of these painkillers. I'm just watching that Netflix a docudrama on this. No, it's just a drama called Painkillers. It's, I think, 6 parts or whatever. It's really worth it to watch. They just lied. I mean, and they captured the regulatory state. I mean, when RFK Jr. rants about big pharma, he's right about that part. They really did. They just pay off these regulators. It's like astonishing.
It's because when I practice, I'm often thinking about these things. I'm wondering, like, and even within the medical community, when you try and have a conversation like that to a medical doctor, a colleague, the moment you bring these things up, they immediately label it. I mean, your book's called Conspiracy, but they immediately think it's a conspiracy. They don't even go beyond to try and determine whether their views, their values, their ethics were formed and just almost curated. And because med school's a long process, it's a very long journey to indoctrination. And I'm not saying that obviously the medical science we were taught is incorrect, but I am saying it is filtered with so much misinformation and guidance from above that we don't really take note and understand.
Yeah, I think this is happening in the trans movement now too. The medical profession seems to be buying into the idea of gender dysphoria as being much more pervasive than it actually is, or it ever was. It was always there at some tiny percentage. It was like 1/10 of 1%. People like this, and now all of a sudden it's 10%, 20%. These kids, or even more. And most of the medical associations seem to be buying into this. Some of the ones in Europe now are having a change of heart on this, that this is probably not a good idea. And the evidence doesn't look like medically transitioning a child reduces or a teenager especially, reduces their anxiety, depression, and mental issues they're having by going through puberty, thinking, well, maybe I'm in the wrong body, this is the model, and therefore my mental issues, psychiatric issues, depression, anxiety, and so forth will go away if I transition. It doesn't look like that's happening at all. And a lot of these kids are being sterilized and, ruined for life, sexually, and their gender is confused. So anyway, but I think somehow the medical profession got captured by this ideology in the way that, we all want to be liberal, tolerant, and accepting of people the way they are. And if they tell us this is the way they are, if somebody says, hey, I'm gay. Okay. But what do I know what's in your head? And that should be okay. You should be the way you want. So I think it's like an extension of that.
Yeah.
And but at some point, didn't you take an oath to first do no harm? Right. So maybe we should do some watchful waiting here and not get captured. But anyway, the larger point here is that even medical professional organizations can get captured.
Yes.
By things, and this is my problem with RFK Jr. because he's a vaccine denier. He has a lot of goofy ideas that are just obviously wrong, and he never changes his mind. That's the other thing that bothers me. I only want to be right. I don't want to be wrong. If somebody will just show me where I'm wrong, I'll change my mind. Well, then people do, and he doesn't respond. So that he's not a fair actor. But he's right when he says, you can't really trust big corporations and big government agencies because they're corrupt. And it's like, yeah, there is a lot of examples of that. That's unfortunate that way. And I think those are 2 examples.
Yeah, and I think it's important to know that people often think that you have to agree with everything someone says to agree with someone, which is the biggest flaw. I mean, it's the worst thing you can actually do. I mean, when I'm talking to these guests, and if I agree with certain aspects, they often think, then they label me into a category with him. And so I must think consciousness is fundamental because I'm talking to Bernardo O'Donnell. No, I actually love these ideas. It's great to explore them. And we don't have to agree. That's the beauty behind this podcast. You're exploring these ideas. That's the beauty behind yours. You're able to have a diverse variety of opinions without trying to indoctrinate someone or change their belief or dogmatize them somehow.
Oh, totally. I love the ideas. Like, are we living in a matrix? This is fun. You talk about this for hours. In fact, David Chalmers' latest book is on this. Yes. Essentially, that we could be living in a matrix kind of thing, and an artificially induced reality and so on. It's big fun, but again, back to your comments, Chomsky's common sense. Go outside and look around. Does it look like we're living in a matrix? Is there any like buffering going on? Like, we have to wait for
the last video I just posted for the podcast is called as with Tom Campbell, and the tagline was we live in a virtual reality. It's very similar. They start with the same premise of okay, consciousness is fundamental and it's all information. See, the fascinating part is it becomes, after that assumption is made, the science behind it becomes very accurate. So he then goes into the evolution of species. Everything else is still very detailed and well. And that's when the argument becomes quite difficult to counter, because it's still grounded in so much science, and it almost has some more explanatory power sometimes, where you start questioning your own reality. And I'm like, oh, man, what is going on here?
Yeah. I don't know. I'd say it's highly unlikely we're living.
Yeah, I mean,
I get the arguments, what are the Copernican principle? What are the chances that, that we're the first? We're probably in the middle of civilizations, and some are more advanced, and they've created this virtual reality, and we're one of those. Yeah. Maybe. But it's got to be running on a hardware somewhere. It can't just be all virtual, as I understand it, virtual reality. You have to have a hardware system set up that runs the original program, and you could have programs on top of within programs, but there has to be a hardware somewhere. So you'd have to have a massive amount of memory to run an entire universe as a virtual reality. Frank Tipler, in his book The Physics of Immortality, it'd have to be 10 to the power bits to replicate everybody who ever lived, and the universe itself. Essentially, it's just the universe. Just create the universe, and that's how many digits there, binary digits there are in it, or something like that. But again, what's more likely? Just go look outside. It doesn't seem like that we're living in a virtual reality. I don't know. My favorite.
Mike, sorry, I think, Michael, I think it froze a little there. Just make sure my connection's stable on this side. We had an issue earlier. Michael, sorry about that.
There we go.
Sorry about that. I'm not.
Oh, there we go.
I have no idea.
Hey, maybe I know what happened. We are in a matrix, and somebody got pissed that we identified them, and they cut us off.
Okay. I think a great thing to do at this point. Let's shift it, because you're not someone who's an idealist, so let's not even focus on that. Let's go back into the material grounding and discuss. So within consciousness, Michael, there's different theories of consciousness within a physicalist perspective. You've got illusionists, you've got panpsychists who think that there's incremental levels of what could be conscious. Emergentism. So at some point, add enough complexity, you'll get to the outcome. These are obviously philosophical ideas, but they have many scientific implications. Christoph Koch, panpsychism can work with IIT very well. Where do you fall within this spectrum of ideas?
I do think it's complex adaptive systems in which, more layers of neural networks, the more complex your conscious sentience can be. I think all animals have some level of sentience. I think my dog, like Christoph talks about his dog a lot, I think my dog is sentient for sure. And he has, is he conscious? Okay, so much of it depends on how you define these terms. And we just say, consciousness is a form of sentience. You're aware of your environment, and you have a model of your environment. You interact with the environment. If you want to go beyond that, you're aware that you're aware. I don't think my dog's aware that he's aware. Of course, I wouldn't know for sure, but it seems unlikely. That requires, layers on top of layers of neural network, something like that. Antonio Damasio has this theory about the models of the world. The brain has these models of everything, so they can even just navigate around the room here without bumping into stuff. I have a model of what the room is like. I have a model of my body. I have a model of how my body moves around these objects and so on. And there's just models on top of models, but in a kind of a meta way, if you have models of models of models of models, at some point, consciousness just kind of emerges consciousness in this sort of self-consciousness way. I'm aware that I'm aware of my models, something like that. Although that always had a feeling to me of, and then a miracle happens. So we have this physical system, and it gets more complex, and then this magical thing happens, and consciousness happens. That's
it's a combination problem in panpsychism. It's the combination problem. At what point it's really happening? We don't have an explanation for that.
Right. It feels like we're doing the God of the gaps argument, and then in that gap right there, that's where the miracle happens, or God steps in, or the consciousness comes online, or I don't know. Again, that may be a conceptual problem we're talking about. Maybe we just don't understand enough about the brain. Again, I'm old enough, well, about to turn 69 next week, that I remember older theories of consciousness and how the brain works, and they're always changing. And it's like, maybe we just really don't know enough to know how to get to an answer, or even construct the problem in a way that's answerable, that it's a soluble problem. And it could be the way we're treating the hard problem of consciousness is, in a way, it's insoluble in that way. That is to say, what it's like to be something. How would you answer that question, what it's like to be a bat? Well, if I went into my little closet over there and closed the door, and I could tell, which, by the structure of the closet, which way, without seeing anything, the structure of it, just by my voice. So maybe that's kind of what it's like to use sonar like a bat does, bouncing sound waves up. But that's just a crude approximation. Maybe if I bolted on some big ears and I develop some sound system, and I change my cortex, and at some point I would just be a bat.
Yeah, exactly.
And I wouldn't be a human asking what it's like to be a bat. I would just be a bat, not wondering anything, except for maybe what it's like to be a human. So in a way, I just don't see how the problem could be answered. The problem of other minds. I don't know for sure that you're not just a philosophical zombie. And it looks like, you're nodding. It looks like you're comprehending what I'm saying, but you could just be some robot that fakes all that. I don't know for sure. But so here I apply the Copernican principle to myself. I do what you do. I'm not special. You're probably not special. You're probably just another human like me. And all our brains are pretty much wired up the same way with neurotransmitter substances and synapses. And you're probably feeling what I'm feeling. There's a good chance that when you show emotions that I recognize, there's a reasonable chance that you are feeling what I feel inside. That seems about as good as it could get, without my actually knowing for sure that your red looks like my red or whatever.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's fundamentally. That's why I think it really is one of those impossible tasks. It's like hitting a brick wall. It's almost impossible to ever really experience someone else's red. It's almost like a fundamental impossibility of reality. But then again, I don't want to go as far as saying that this is almost an Ian Vitale of another topic.
Well, I don't know. It's back to that kind of dualism. It suggests that the little homunculus in me, my mini me, can tiptoe over into your skull to see what your red looks like. It's just an incomprehensible idea.
It is. It's just fundamentally. And that's another example. We're still stuck in that dualistic way of thinking. Even with the virtual reality, if there's a software or a hardware, there still has to be these two elements almost. It's like we've got to have these two component parts in order to have this discussion, which is strange. It's very difficult to escape.
Yeah, back to Chomsky. It's like, what does it seem like? Use common sense. Come on. Isn't it more likely that all the other people around you are, like you? They're not philosophical zombies. And while you can't know exactly what they're feeling, you can ask, you can look, you can be perceptive. Well, here's this person crying on the sidewalk and they're lying there. I suspect they feel sad. That's a reasonable assumption, right? There's something going on. I'm going to walk over there and go, "Are you okay? Can I do something to help?" It's not delusional. That's a reasonable assumption.
Your initial approach when you focused on that sentience, Nicholas Humphrey, I'm sure.
Yeah,
he wrote
I don't know.
Sentience. Yeah, he wrote the book Sentience. So he calls it almost the invention of consciousness. So he started off as an illusionist because he believes that these introspective ideas that we have about the mind and the way we introspect about it eventually culminates into this conclusion that we have this almost essence-like entity that is consciousness. And that's the fundamental problem, is the way we're conceiving of this entity might be an issue. But his view also changed over time. And then his view became what he now calls phenomenal surrealism. He actually thinks that, in fact, the essence-like experience that we are experiencing, even though it might be something akin to an introspective illusion, it's still actually more real than what red actually is. So in essence, because we're experiencing redness from this wonderful mechanism that we call our bodies, it turns out to be even more real than the actual reality, because this is our fundamental experience. I might be butchering it a little bit, but that's basically where he goes with it.
Yeah. I was trying to pull up something here to read. Steve Pinker had a nice description of this problem in his book, Enlightenment Now. Let me see if I can find it. I don't have the book here in front of me, but and
he also wrote a great book. I think it was called How Minds Work. I think I've got it here somewhere.
Yeah, that was his second book. Language Instinct was the first one. Yeah, okay, let's see. No, I don't have that.
Got the ones like the.
But anyway, yeah, but the idea is, again, it may just be one of these insoluble problems because of the way we're conceptualizing it in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, there's clearly that language element that really does limit us. I mean, we can only do so much with science based on the way we can communicate the science. I mean, even the way we think. We can never really step out of language while thinking. Like when I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to talk to Michael later, I'm still thinking about me saying the fact that I'm going to talk to Michael later. I mean, it's still almost a verbal thought process. So it's in a sense.
I found some notes here I made on this problem. Talking about Donald Hoffman's idea. Let me see what else we got here.
Let me also find is that Isaac Asimov. I really want you to read this. Isaac Asimov.
But you didn't freeze on me there. Oh no, you're looking.
I'm sorry. I'm just checking out this essay I want you to check out with Isaac Asimov.
Oh right.
And let's see if I can find this. I think. It's called The Beginning and the End. This collection of 23 essays wrote a couple of decades. It could be the same thing I'm thinking about. I'm not really sure. Read it a while back, and it's a wonderful. I see you've got the frames there. Yeah. What inspired those?
Which frames? Asimov. Well, he was. We put him on the cover of our first issue of Skeptic magazine. Let's see if I have that here. Let me see. Yeah, hang on. Let me grab that. I'll show you. There it is, Volume 1, Number 1.
Oh, look at that!
30 years ago, 31 years ago. And you can still order it. We have cases of them right here in my office, so people can still get.
I mean, Isaac
back issues.
Is still one of the. I mean, he's one of the goats of science fiction. He's definitely one of the greatest of all time. He's He's probably my favorite.
Oh yeah.
I see today you actually tweeted something about Arthur C. Clarke. What is that about? What again?
This morning's tweet. Yes, I'll read it because it's. I don't know. I just disagreed with what he said here, but from his quote, two possibilities exist: either we are alone in the universe, or we're not. Both are equally terrifying. I don't think it's terrifying at all. First of all, as I wrote, if the former, all the more reason we need to be good stewards of our home planet, as well as become a multiplanetary interstellar species. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself, said Carl Sagan. If the latter, it would be exhilarating to make contact with extraterrestrials, learn from them how they solve various problems on their home planet, like collective action problems like global warming, nuclear proliferation, or technical problems like sustainable energy and alternatives to chemical rockets, and scientific problems like the nature of consciousness, dark matter, dark energy, etc. It would be exciting either way. I don't know why he said that it's terrifying. You know, there is this kind of meme going around about, why the government doesn't want to disclose what it knows about aliens, because it'll terrify people and people will lose their religions and the stock market will crash. Well, this is nonsense. Why would any of that happen? I've never heard a good explanation for that. Much less like that, since we're on the subject, like that AI will cause the extinction of this, not only our species, but all life on Earth. How would this happen? And I never hear a good answer. Short of something like it'll trick Putin into launching a nuclear strike and we'll counter-strike and it'll be global thermonuclear war and it'll kill everything on Earth. Yeah, but there's so many ways to prevent that from happening already in place that a deep fake video seems unlikely to be able to trigger something like that.
Mm. Do you think AI, though, do you think it will be the, well, if, let's say, if it was, as you said earlier, if it was the teleological entity to take forward this sort of thought process, do you think we would either join somehow and become symbiotic creatures with these machinery?
Yeah.
Or do you think that's the best?
Yeah. I think it'd be like another tool, an instrument we can use or integrate with our own lives, something like that. I mean, we already do this. Cochlear implants for hearing, hip replacements. I've had two. Yeah, just using tech. We already do this. This using technology to make life better, rather than thinking of it. The negativity bias. What could go wrong? How about what could go right? How about the development of drugs is a lengthy, expensive process because you have to test all these different conditions. Computers, AI could do this way faster. How about we just solve one little problem like Alzheimer's? Let's see if AI can help us solve one. There was all, like when I was writing about longevity and living forever and Ray Kurzweil, the singularity is coming, we get to live forever and so on. All right, forget this goal, like we're going to live for forever. How about just get me to 100 without Alzheimer's, okay, or cancer? Just start with one little thing. Just solve one problem. Let's just put AI to work and see if it can solve this problem. Like self-driving cars, this would be good. I think it's a much harder problem than anyone realized. But keep working on it. If we could just, instead of like self-driving completely, how about just not no lock brakes that was developed in the 70s. Just little things like that. Nav systems that are a little more efficient. Anything that could just slightly reduce the amount of carnage in automobile accidents. Let's just work on that. Don't have this. It's all or none kind of thing.
I think another great application for it I was thinking about quite recently was psychiatry. I mean, if you take the average lack of psychiatrists per patient. I mean, if you could have artificial intelligence having the psychotherapy, if we could get the best psychiatrists together, allow this thing to machine learn or get some sort of an algorithm that allows it to communicate with patients, it would be quite remarkable what it could do.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's another example. Back to the brain, how much we don't know. If you just take the field of psychiatry and just take some of the psychoses like schizophrenia, there's still so much we don't know about the cause, treatments. It's really kind of depressing when you read the literature going, wow, when I started college, this was going to be it. We're going to solve this problem by the 90s. It just didn't happen. And it's a much harder problem than we realized. But maybe AI could help with that.
Exactly.
How do you...
Psychiatrists had all these revolutions. I mean, the neuroscientific one, the genetic component. I mean, we thought we'd solve it with genes. I mean, we consistently failed at trying to figure out the psychiatric condition.
Yeah, same thing with Alzheimer's. I don't have the Alzheimer's genes. I got the 23andMe. And so, okay. But then when you actually read the literature on that, it's like those two genes, they don't make that big of a difference. I mean, it's not a determining factor. It's just could nudge you slightly in the direction of getting it for some other reason that you're actually getting it, Exactly. Or, the plaques and tangles. Oh, Alzheimer's is the plaques and tangles. Well, but there are people who are autopsied and they have plaques and tangles and never showed any signs of Alzheimer's at all. And then there's people that die of Alzheimer's and they don't have any plaques and tangles. Okay, obviously there's more than that. It's a really hard problem. So again, why not turn AI on that? See if we can solve those kinds of problems.
Yeah, no, I think it's
Kevin Kelly calls this protopia. Rather than utopia, forget aiming for utopia, perfect, life for everybody everywhere right now. That's not going to happen. How about protopia? Just make tomorrow slightly better than today, just like 1% better, just a tiny little bit, and do that every day for the next century, and life will be quite a bit better. That's what we've been doing.
Yeah. So you agree basically with Steven Pinker's assessment of the progress we've made so far?
Oh yeah, totally.
What for those who disagree, what would you say to them?
Well, those who disagree are mostly subject to the negativity bias. That is to say, negative things stand out twice as much as positive things. It's kind of a derivative of loss aversion in behavioral economics. Losses hurt twice as much as gains feel good. So if you want to get somebody to make an investment, you have to show them that the payoff is going to be twice as rewarding as the loss would feel bad, because that's going to drive their investment behaviors. And so we know, for example, like on social media, that you could get 100 likes, but that one negative guy that, that's the one that you'll remember. Who was this asshole that said that about me? What about the 100 people that like you? Forget them. I don't like that. How come that guy doesn't like me? Those are the things that stand out. And there's a good reason for this. The second law of thermodynamics, entropy, there's more ways for things to go bad than go good. There's more ways for your body to break down than it is for it to get better. It's just the way it is. Just nature runs its course. Just take a sandcastle. There's only so many limited ways you can shape sand and water into some structure that looks nice, like a sandcastle. But there's an infinite number of ways for it to wash away on a road, and waves and wind and dogs and children and things that just cause it to revert back into a blob of nothingness. And that's what life is like. I mean, if you do nothing, things just run down. Bedrooms get cluttered, your body gets flabby, your mind gets weak. Beds don't get made on their own. Poverty is what you get when you do nothing. We don't need books on poverty. We know what poverty is. The default. It's what's the origin of wealth? That's the hard problem, and so on. So anyway,
it's almost
rambling here, but
it's almost like flipping that framework and the perspective can actually make a big impact on finding solutions.
Sorry, I lost the thread there. Yeah. So the people that criticize me and Pinker and other positive people, progressivists or whatever we want to call it, they're just more focused on the negative things. And the fact is, there will always be negative things. There will always be homicides. It's never going to be zero. There's always going to be a few racist assholes out there, misogynist assholes, and they will stand out. Like, how can you say things are better in race relations when look what those police did to that black guy? Yeah, I know. It's terrible what they did, to George Floyd. Yeah, it's awful. It's terrible. But let's not think that that's the way it normally is. What's the base rate compared to what? And there, the data, you have to look at the data. You have to follow the trend lines, not the headlines. The news, by definition, only reports the bad stuff. They don't report, here we are at a school with our camera crew and there's been no shootings all day. You're never going to get that. There's no news there. News is when bad things happen. So I think most of the critics are just focused on the bad things, or even say, life was better in the Paleolithic. We know from fossils that people were taller than they were, say 5,000 BC. They had fewer cavities. They had less arthritis in their bones. They really had a better life than all the way up until modern people. Yeah, that's true. Diets, the so-called Paleolithic diet, there's nothing magical about it, but it's the variation. They had about 300 different kinds of foods. We have about 30 different kinds of foods that we consume. It's better to have variety in your diet. That's the kind of lesson of that. But we're not going back to the Paleolithic where there's 100,000 people on the entire planet. That's never going to happen. So we have to go forward, solving the problems that civilization caused, like a monoculture that produces very few food substances and sedentary lifestyle, and on and on and on. Diseases that spread in large populations that didn't have that problem in the Paleolithic, because these are small groups of a few dozen people, and so there were no disease contagions to rapidly spread through millions of people. That just didn't happen. Well, okay, but how many of you want to go back to living off the land as hunter-gatherers? No, I wouldn't even know how to do it. Nobody could do it. And so, just watch that show, Naked and Afraid. Yeah. They dump those people out there in the middle of nowhere, and they got a week to find their way. Oh my God. Who wants to live like that?
I mean, another very common misconception is you take the average person and you tell them you could go back in time, and they get all carried away. Like, yeah, I could invent everything. Yeah. I could do anything. But the truth is they can't. The average human cannot do the most basic things we take for granted every day. They think they can invent the wheel all over again. They don't know where to begin.
Just think about dentistry. It's improved so much just in my own lifetime. What the dentist can do to keep your teeth going when people live longer. It's a miracle.
It's crazy. The amount of innovation and technology that and it's consistently exponentially rising at this point. So
yeah,
do you think what's going to happen in the future? It's pretty phenomenal. Michael, how are you doing for time at the moment? You fine?
I better stop in about 7 minutes. So give me 15 minutes before my next podcast. So 11:15.
I think to close, Michael, let's your book's called Conspiracy. I mean, you want to just briefly run through me, like from within this conversation, any high-rated conspiracies could hinder this conversation somehow.
Well, I guess if it related to anything we're talking about, it's a signal detection problem. How do I know if this conspiracy theory is true or not? Now, the problem is there are conspiracies. We mentioned some of those, the big pharma capturing the regulatory state by bribing people. This happens all the time, insider trading. How do these congressmen start, they get elected and they're worth nothing. 10 years later, they're worth $100 million. How does this happen? They conspire. There's insider trading. I mean, there's all kinds. Companies do this. Government agencies do. Watergate was a conspiracy. The CIA has done all sorts of things in its existence that, without the approval of Congress, or maybe quasi-legal or not. Assassination of foreign leaders, overturning foreign country elections to favor a dictator over the other dictator, because we prefer the fascist dictator over the communist dictator because they're friendlier to U.S. business interests. This kind of stuff happens all the time. So, but that doesn't mean the government's hiding the aliens, or they faked the moon landing, or they orchestrated 9/11. You have to take them one at a time. So then it becomes a signal detection problem. I hear a conspiracy theory. How do I know if it's true or not? And then we can just apply the normal methods of rationality and science to, well, okay, let's ask, what's the source of that claim? Who said that? And where was that published? And did anybody fact check it? And what's the evidence for it? How do you know that's true? It may be true. Again, Bayesian, maybe it's not zero. It could be true, but does that fit with the way the world works? How many people would have to be involved in the conspiracy? A few people. Okay, that's possible. Most conspiracies involve very few people, because people can't keep their mouth shut. They're incompetent. They, coordinating. Everybody has to be at the right place at the right time, and there's 100 different people that have to do their exact thing at 2:00. Unlikely to happen. There's just too many chance, contingencies, randomness, incompetence, and so on. I've been tweeting since my book came out, the kind of the standard skeptical line on this. Never attribute to malice what can be explained by incompetence or chance. And then the plane crash with Prigozhin in it. I said, never mind, not this time. This one is definitely probably malice, because But again, how do I know that? Well, everybody knows Putin, has his enemies assassinated. And so it's, very likely to be the case in there, but again, you have to take them one by one. What's the evidence? What's the, the likelihood that somebody could do that sort of thing? Do they have the power to do it? Are they in a position to do it? And so forth. And, that's what insider trading investigations are all about. That's, what the SEC does when they launch those investigations, or, congressional hearings on ethical issues in Congress. They're looking for evidence for a conspiracy. Is it there or not? Yeah. Did the Democrats conspire to steal the 2020 election? Okay, that's a conspiracy theory. Could be true. Is it in fact true? And how would you and I know? I wouldn't know even who to call, but the Department of Justice can check that, and they did. And but they're Democrats. No, they actually weren't. Bill Barr, who was the head of the Department of Justice, Attorney General Bill Barr, lifelong Republican. He voted for Trump, and so on. And he looked into it and said, nope, there's nothing there. We got nothing. And then all those court cases, dozens and dozens of court cases that were all thrown out, no evidence of vote tampering and so on. That's how you and I can know without checking ourselves. These are people that were in a position who would like to find that there was voter fraud, but in fact found none. So that tells us there's a pretty good chance there was no voter fraud. The 2020 election was on the up and up.
Michael, to close off, let's end it on a positive note. As you were talking, things are getting better. So I noticed that you love magic, and you do a lot of these cool magic tricks. I saw them on YouTube, and I was curious to know, how do you see magic as a great tool to uncover the true nature of reality and expose a lot of our flaws of thought? This is a great way to close.
Well, in the same way that these famous psychology illusions, work. They in a way tell us how the brain actually works, because normally we're not fooled by those things. It takes a special kind of way of that the drawing is made, or the structure or the magic trick is done to fool people. But that tells us that actually most of the time we're not fooled, and that we can figure out reality. The magician has to go through great lengths to make these things work out a certain way, or else the magic doesn't work. And in a way, it's why it's not fun to find out how most magic tricks are done, because they're so obviously simple. They're just a misdirection, or whatever. I don't want to give away too much stuff, but the spoon bending, or the stuff I'm not a magician, but I like magic because it's an instrument to show people how easy it can be fooled if it's done in a certain way. And so when people tell me, well, Uri Geller, he's bending spoons, he's using his mind and so on, and he moves the molecules of the atoms, somehow he influences them. And I say, well, okay, so when you see David Copperfield make the Statue of Liberty disappear, do you think he actually moves the atoms of the Statue of Liberty and then puts them back? Well, no, of course not. I know he doesn't do that. That's impossible. Right. So it's a magic trick. Why wouldn't you think Uri Geller or some illusionist is just doing a magic trick? Or the psychics that allegedly talk to the dead. This is a magic trick. It's it's called mentalism, and they're cold reading, warm reading, hot reading. They have their techniques that really work, tried and true, and practiced like magicians do, and they can fool people. So if you don't think Copperfield is really moving the Statue of Liberty, why would you think the psychic is really talking to dead people? First of all, anybody can talk to dead people. Getting the dead to talk back, that's the hard part, right? So how do they make it look like that's what's happening? It's a magic trick. So it's another instrument for us to say, don't be fooled. Look how easy it is to be fooled with this trick. Okay. So I'll tell you one story on a Scientific American cruise through the Bermuda Triangle, and I was one of the guest speakers. It was big fun. So the dinner, we're all having dinner together every night, and so somebody tells me the story. Oh, I saw this guy bending the spoon. It was incredible, like Uri Geller. It wasn't Uri Geller, but and I just can't figure out how he did it. And it wasn't just the normal thing where you have the handle of the spoon and the bowl of the spoon, and the bowl just kind of bends down. No, he said it was twisted in a way that it was just impossible. He could not have twisted it, in this normal way, because it's just the steel is too strong. Well, this is another trick I happen to know of how to do this bend, that it's actually quite easy to do. So as he's talking to me, I take the spoon off my table and I put it down here below the table, and I do the little bend trick. And as he's finishing the story, I said, did it look anything like this? And he's like, oh no, you just did that? I go, yep. He goes, how'd you do it? I go, I'm not going to tell you, but it's really easy. He's like, oh. So it's a way of going, look, I know it seems like it could be this, but don't be fooled.
It's often so disappointing when you see the reality. I mean, one of the people who got me intrigued by the mind itself was Darren Brown. I'm not sure if you.
Oh yes, well he's phenomenal. He's absolutely phenomenal. The way he does it, yes, he is brilliant. He's one of the great mentalists of all time, in my opinion. Now I know how he does a lot of it, but it's the execution that is so good. And artful. I mean, he's an artist. It's just the way his presentation and the music and the whole staged effects and so on. Yeah, it's just great.
Yeah. Well, Michael, thank you so much. I mean, this has been such a pleasure for me. I've been following your work for so many years. I mean, it's a privilege to talk to you, and I appreciate your time so much.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. And I love your show too. It's great. Your conversations are always deep. This is the amazing thing about podcasts. You can have deep conversations like this without it's never been that way before in media. So that's good.
It's a beautiful platform. And thank you so much once again. Any final words from your side, Michael?
Just listeners that are interested, you can go to skeptic.com and check out our magazine. Here, I showed you the Asimov one. Here's the latest issue. We're 4-color now. Physical magazine. It's still hanging in there. And so we're supported by Skeptic Society, 501c3 nonprofit, science education. So if you support us, go to skeptic.com.
And everyone can also, I'll put a link to the Michael Shermer Show. Thanks again, Michael. I appreciate everything.
Okay.
Cheers.
All right. Bye-bye. Okay. All right. Bye-bye.